Merci, Marie-Hélène.
Thank you, Marie-Hélène, Olivier, and Manolita for organizing this event. I'm really delighted to be here, not only because we met a few months ago in Urbino, where we began to develop this theme, but also within the framework of the publication that was just mentioned. We began thinking about this idea of appropriation relative to modernism, not only trying to see what was behind the word appropriation, whether appropriation also covers the creation of something new that can emerge from the encounter between a very urbanist, modernist urbanism and an urbanism that has been called an urbanism without urbanists, which is after urbanists, which could generate a third term, which could be perhaps a hybrid. Try to understand what, if this is really happening, and after these 3 days, I hope we will have an even better idea on this. My French is very limited, so I'm going to shift to English. I'm sorry, but I hope it will be better for the... So now we'll go to South America, in particular Lima, the capital of Peru, to see what's happening at Unidad Vecinal número 3.
So, the Unidad Vecinal número 3, you can see here in a first image, the image, in fact, of its glorification in the modernist journals of the time, built in what at the time was a remote area compared to the city of Lima, by a very important set of architects which represented the modernist avant-garde at the time, something that, of course, we recognize in a number of other contexts. And that, well, just in its name, in fact, of Unidad Vecinal, summarizes, synthesizes the emerging concept which was going to drive the modernization of Lima at the time. There is something strange to talk about modernity in Lima somehow, because for anybody who has actually followed human settlements and the, well, growth of Lima, of course, Lima is mostly known as the city that built itself. In the kind of quite interesting statistics that follow the development of Latin American capital cities, Lima is usually quite high on the list of a city that was mostly built, self-built by migrants coming in, not only from the Andean region, but in fact from the whole country. And that were basically starting settlements such as these, known as barriadas. And therefore, housing policy in the country became also very well known for a certain laissez-faire attitude vis-a-vis these developments, and also in the end to try and even foster them, to try and even, well, half-organize them while they were occupying the desert areas, mainly towards the south, the east, and the north, in fact, of the coastal city of Lima. So to speak about modernity, of course, is something that needs to be said in dialogue with this kind of landscape, and of course, this has already been done by a number of other people besides myself. So again, another image of these striking settlements, which are usually what we find when we look at Lima's history. Very often related, in fact, to the whole law, also urban legislation that in the 1960s allowed, in fact, these developments to happen, the most important one being the Ley Orgánica de Barrios Marginales that you can see mentioned here, which was all about allowing, in fact, for these settlements to happen in particular locations where, of course, land value was not very high and where then other prime areas could be maintained in a state, of course, of well, rise in values and so forth. Lima is also known, of course, because a number of important people, such as John Turner, have then reified, celebrated the self-built city. So amongst many of the publications that have been released, in fact, in the 1960s, is, of course, also this publication here, which is all about, in fact, how these self-built developments were actually working, how they were something that should be considered as part of the environment. And of course, therefore, challenging city-making quite early on at the time with this very meaningful issue of architectural design, which was, well, titled The Architecture of Democracy. But This also means that there was a real work being done in terms of the understanding and then the glorification, in a certain sense, of these environments. This did not happen only through Turner, who was basically the person responsible for this to then be, reach a more international kind of resonance, but it was very much already happening, of course, in Peru, particularly with anthropologists like José Matos Mar, whose famous work on the barriadas of Lima, published then in 1957, became a really important reference for anyone who was trying to understand these self-built environments. This also means, however, that very early on in public policy and public housing policy, we start seeing some interest in what Helen Geiger has called the informal as a project. So the whole idea of capturing certain qualities, in fact, of informal development, associating them with low-cost housing developments, which could, in fact, start as a degree zero, let's say, of urbanism in certain neighborhoods and so forth. One of the meaningful competitions in this sense is, for example, the Casa Barata competition, so the economic or the low-cost house competition, which was launched by Pedro Beltrán and La Prensa, which was actually won by Calvo Agurto with this idea of the house that grows, something that we will find significantly in a number of other countries as well, a kind of reading of the house as something that's extendable, expandable, within, of course, certain guidelines and certain ideas of relationship between open and built space. And this is also something that was very clearly, in fact, engaged with when Peru participated with a kind of national pavilion in the 14th Architecture Biennale, which has already been mentioned here in the introduction, about this whole idea, in fact, of a relationship between the barriada and then the modernist Unidad Vecinal. And Sharif Kahat, who was in fact the curator of this pavilion, sets in dialogue the Unidad Vecinal número 3, that you can see on one hand side, and the barriada of the Cerro San Cosme. They both appeared on the scene of Lima at the same time in 1946, and for him it is really about this tension, and modernity should be read along these lines, along the whole idea of hybridization and constant cultural negotiation, and not just as a very kind of imposed project traveling from North America and Western Europe into Lima. And so just to kind of share some excerpts of Sharif Kahat's own thinking, really this whole idea of the fissures and the tensions and the singularities which have characterized the process of modernity coming in, and about this whole encounter of a rationally systemized spatial organization with a spontaneously squatted, self-built architecture. And here, again, very importantly mentioning the Unidad Vecinal número 3 as a starting point of this whole reflection, where in fact then what we start seeing in the other Unidad Vecinales and in the other projects are very often not towers, not slabs, but in fact an infinite variation of the Unidad Vecinal, where this whole possibility of a middle ground is actually reflected upon. And I think that's very important because we should nuance a little bit what the project of modernity has been in each of these contexts, of course. And Peru is one where the informal has come in quite significantly. So Unidad Vecinal número 3 on one hand, Cerro San Cosme on the other. We are, of course, now going to focus on Unidad Vecinal número 3 in itself, which here now you can see in a more recent image of 2009, completely embedded, of course, in the context of Lima, that has continued to grow quite radically. And that has, in the meantime, been transformed. What has not been completely violated, of course, is the actual entre-deux, so the in-between. There was a significant percentage, once again, of open space. Something around 87% of the site was not built. And this percentage has lowered, but it has, in fact, been also greatly promoted as one of the qualities of the environment today, which, of course, we see very clearly when we confront it with a completely self-built environment, where this relationship is very, very different. What is important, of course, to note is that both Cerro San Cosme and Unidad Vecinal were trying to escape from such situation that you see here. So what was basically known as the Callejón, the inner city slum. This is actually a drawing of one of these speculative inner city slums, interestingly enough related to urban disorganization by Richard Wilbur Patch, incredible densities and inhuman, let's say, conditions, which is then also what triggers, in fact, a whole reflection on insalubrious housing in Peru itself. Peru had undergone a very violent earthquake in 1940. This also meant that it started in a very different position than other Latin American countries when these were set in the frame of the good neighbor policy in relation with the United States of America. But this launched a whole process also of promotion of Siam principles through the figures, in fact, of José Luis Sert and Wiener, more particularly, and the efforts of a number of people, including Fernando Belaúnde Terry, who was himself trained as an architect but was basically a politician involved first as a deputy in Lima and who then later in the 60s became the president of Peru, to in fact launch a campaign for a different kind of housing policy. And here we see a reflection, in fact, on these tugurios as very, very unsuitable environments for human development, to say the least. So a whole number of studies are launched right after, in fact, the idea also of unidad vecinales starts coming to the fore. And here in the Plan Piloto, which is also where you can see, sorry, I was looking for the mouse, the position of the unidad vecinal número 3, there is, in fact, a whole idea of readdressing Lima's structure, of creating 7 unidades vecinales, and of basically, trying to then promote a different form of living, also based, in fact, on particular connections between these unidades. And this is all the more interesting to look at when one compares this with the actual then development of dwelling resource in South America, as John Turner was calling them at the time, where we then see also the location of the squatter settlements, the barriadas, which start in fact being developed in what then will be called the Cono Norte, the Cono Este, and the Cono Sur, away from the slums of the center, and away, in fact, from the normal built-up areas. Now you can see the UV3 in context. Again, it is now, in fact, in a very, a much more connected position, of course, than at the time, which was, on the other hand, in between the port of Callao and Lima's colonial center, and so which made it, in fact, much more a product of a tension between these two entities before Lima developed like it has today. The promotion of the Unidad Vecinal número 3 really happened through the mediums that were related also to the figure of Belaúnde Terry. So he was a deputy in Lima, but he was also the founder of a journal called El Arquitecto Peruano, which was basically there to promote principles related to modernism, also very much linked to the whole idea of a Peruvian Siam fraction, let's say, although Sharif Kahat is adamant in stressing that they had an autonomy, that they were not simply a kind of franchise in Peru, and promoting, therefore, a kind of life that is, I think, quite well synthesized in these few excerpts. The whole idea, of course, of self-sufficiency, which we have heard in a number of infinite variations when it comes to these modernist neighborhoods. The whole idea of leading an independent and self-sufficient life because of the amount of services that were actually associated with the construction of housing. Here you see Belaúnde Terry in front, in fact, of the Unidad Vecinal número 3. The conception began in 45 and it was complete, in fact, by 49, including services. This is all about also a certain relationship between the car and the inhabitant, something that has already been pointed out in the previous presentation was, of course, today of a much different kind. The services were concentrated in the core, so the basic concept of the Unidad Vecinal was to, in fact, cater for about 1,000 families. We're talking about 5,000 inhabitants, more or less, and around 1,112 residential units. There were 3 typologies involved, which were supposed to have a kind of idea of mixity within the neighborhood. First of all, the chalet, which were actually for very large families, and these were ranging with 4 to 5 rooms. There were then apartment blocks for kind of intermediate families, and then the Soltero Blocks, so the bachelor housing, which was basically for singles. All these were supposed to then be glued together by an amount, in fact, of services, some of which are represented here, which included a market, a cinema and cultural center, playgrounds, 2 schools, swimming pools, and of course, a certain abundance of open space, which you can already, and you've already, I'm sure, noticed. These are some images, in fact, of the marketplace at the time of its making. So again, this was about a kind of self-sufficiency of life, something that was not going, in fact, to basically push people out of the neighborhood in a significant way. And the position, in fact, of Unidad Vecinal Número 3 next to also some industrial facilities meant that even in terms of work, live relationships, this was all about short distance movements. So we heard again in the previous presentation the whole idea of a 500-meter limit in terms of general movement. This is a figure that comes again in the description of the Unidad Vecinal Número 3. So this whole idea that schools should be within a 500-meter range, which is of course something that has an earlier setting. Here you can see some of the services as built in very importantly, the chapel, which is still, quite significant today, swimming pool, and also kindergarten. And here, some images of the actual housing units, which we will look at into more detail today. These are the 3 typologies that I've mentioned, so the chalet, the blocks, and then the Soltero apartments, which are characterized by these balconies. Now, something that accompanied the construction was also the whole idea that because this was catered, so the kind of discourse was this is neither philanthropy nor charity. So we're actually going to provide apartments that are for rent, and they are going to cater for at least these kind of inhabitants. There was a certain ratio in relation to income that was expected to be respected, and the whole idea was therefore that a number of people could find their way in to these kind of neighborhoods. This was clearly a kind of agenda that then became less and less kind of clear over time, but at the same time this was a starting point that was important. Now to the transformations, which are of course perhaps the most interesting thing in discussion also with the other cases here today. What we see, of course, is that the transformations vary quite significantly when, of course, we start from this typological differentiation, simply because some allow a much easier transformation than others. The chalet, for example, with this ground floor apartment and then a duplex apartment on top of it, are the ones that have been transformed the most, not just within the kind of built block itself, but also in terms of the occupation of the areas in front of them. The blocks see mostly a ground floor transformation. We know that this is, of course, quite easy to kind of maneuver. So all those negotiations that we heard about from Philippe Panret in the introduction are still, I guess, underway because they still haven't reached such a level as the cases we saw in Cairo. And in terms of the Soltero blocks, well, these were very, they were harder to be modified kind of externally, but they are in fact the ones that have been transformed the most, because as you can imagine, the people who started as singles did not stay single, and therefore a whole kind of mismatch between the amount of family members and the original nucleus became very, very apparent. So to start with the chalet, we see here the kind of infinite variations on a theme of extending and then enlarging, and then also, in fact, modifying apartments in terms of security, which is an issue that returns not only at the level of the single unit, but at the level of the entire neighborhood. This is, of course, a kind of leitmotif in Lima. You will see it also in the self-built settlements, which have now reached a certain level of consolidation. But of course, it's something that modifies, in fact, the relationship between also the vast open space quite significantly. Reasons behind this are not only because there is car ownership and some ground floors now host garages, but in general because a fear of crime and violence is very much mentioned. There's a general sentiment of insecurity, and this is really all over the city, I would say. Just to give some examples in more detail in terms of some of the planned transformations, and I must say that this is work that has been done by three very, very vigorous students from KU Leuven who were able to spend several months in Lima and document a number, in fact, of these unidades vecinales. So Margot, Sophie, and Treuil are the ladies that I should thank here for this work. But this is a kind of classic case, in fact, of a chalet and then its transformation. We see, of course, how the ground floor has extended. Basic motivations, I mean, are, apart from family size, are related to the idea of hosting home-based economic activities. So the whole idea, in fact, of being able to start up a little commerce to make ends meet, which of course begin once people also become owners, which is a major shift in the life of the Unidad Vecinal Número 3. And this is something that, of course, we see because it's from that date onwards that the major modifications start occurring. And then we see that, on the other hand, in the case of the duplexes, what basically happens is, of course, there is room for vertical extension, and so this takes on board the possibility, in fact, of having extra space, sometimes even having more than households, so that when a son gets married, he can start having a little unit of his own before he might leave for other larger locations. And this is another case of a family, in fact, de la Barre, who wanted to open a restaurant, and this is exactly what they do. In fact, they open a little restaurant that works on and off, which of course has that possibility of being used intermittently as a resource and not regularly. And another case where transformations, in fact, are of a less significant nature. If we turn to the blocks, we can see here already from the image below that there is a transformation of the ground floors that is quite vigorously apparent. The kind of units are connected by these winding staircases, and here too there has been room for transformation. The grilles that were being spoken about in the opening presentation are very present here. And here we see the nature of the extensions. Again, the ground floor moves quite significantly out. And then it's coupled by privatization of the open space. So there is indeed something that becomes very important in this condition. And finally, in the Soltero, so in the Batchelor Blocks, a very typical situation is that the balconies have been partly englobed, taken in, and in many cases there's been the merging of more than one apartment precisely because of the nature of changing family members. And this has meant also that there's a certain question of how then the turnover has occurred in this neighborhood, how this neighborhood has reacted, in fact, to its environments. Here you see a much bigger flat that hasn't been obtained, in fact, by the merger of two, which also has a reflection, in fact, on the level of the services in the neighborhood and the position of the neighborhood and how it reacts, in fact, to its immediate surroundings. So besides what has changed within the residences, there's of course a lot to be said about the nature of the services. First of all, the market, for example, that sees a real tension between the fundadores, so the people who arrived at the time, who still have, for example, a stall, and that are trying to keep the market working, and in fact the emergence of, of course, larger commercial spaces outside the neighborhood, which have then become part and parcel of everyday shopping, and that therefore puts the market in a very difficult position. It's the same with a number of shops that have risen on the border of UV3. This is an example of, excuse me, of Pollos a la Brasa, but actually this is also a shop that's not very active. So there's a whole tension between the residential kind of dimension of the neighborhood and the possibility of actually injecting commerces which operate at a level that go beyond the neighborhood itself. The cinema and the community center are now no longer working, so there's a lot of questions, in fact, about how then these services and the meaning, in fact, of these services today. And quite interestingly, because of the location of UV3 next, in fact, to a very important university, the Universidad de San Marcos in Lima, there's been a whole student housing kind of element that's entered the neighborhood, not only in the neighborhood itself, but actually in the immediate surroundings. So what you see here are the kind of buildings that are being built next to the UV3, not only for the students in question, but where a lot of the second generation of UV3 actually now live. So there is something that was, or that emerged a lot from, in fact, the fieldwork, was that there is a sense of community, so to speak, and that there is this idea of remaining in close proximity of Unidad Vecinal número 3 if there is not room within it. And this is something that has appeared quite significantly in the interviews that were run by the students. There is something to say about the demise, let's say, of the open space and the kind of security challenges that are being placed on board. These are some of the very nostalgic also accounts that emerge from the fundadores in seeing how what had been innovative at the time, what had been groundbreaking, incredible also service provision, is no longer considered as something qualitative or as something that can be used because of security issues and other social dynamics that have emerged. And at the same time, as I mentioned, security is not a question only of single housing unit, an apartment, but it's actually very much at the level of gating the whole of Unidad Vecinal número 3. So you see here the kind of discourse about, the presence, in fact, of thieves and other forms of crime that have decreased because not only there are gates, but there are security guards which actually appear. All this, of course, from the private investment of families coming together. And lastly, something to say about the open space, which is, again, in a very kind of contentious position. The green space was divided, it was organized differently, as in fact Mary Martinez mentions. Everybody had the possibility of having also a garden and so forth. But because of changing trends and so forth, also because of crime, what has been happening is basically that the municipality has created one large grass field. Social control and visibility have been the major motivations here, and then there is a certain neglect that has immediately appeared. And so this whole question of the entre-deux as a very open space, as a very large space, as a very collective space, that then, however, is not clearly owned by anyone, means that actually there is a real big question in what will happen there. And in fact, when it was subdivided, when it was fragmented, there was a much greater care and involvement from the inhabitants themselves. And that's something, I guess, to keep in mind when we reflect on the other entre-deux, including the ones in Europe. And with this, I thank you. I think my time is over, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation.
Merci. Bravo.
If you don't mind, I will speak in English. I have to thank you to beginning with for the organization, for the invitation to be able to be here. What I will present is work on OCA. OCA stands for Office des Cités Africaines, which is a parastatal colonial organization that was between 1950 and 1960. Has been building 40,000 new houses in what was then Belgian Congo, distributed more or less 20,000 in what now has become Kinshasa, which was Leopoldville, and the other, between brackets, big cities of Congo at that moment, being Elizabethville, Lubumbashi, Kisangani, Stanleyville, Bukavu, Costanceville, etc. 40,000 houses, 20,000 more or less for Leopoldville, Kinshasa, distributed over 5 satellite towns. The idea is to build instantly a kind of welfare colony, as in many, many colonies after the Second World War, in an attempt to keep, in an attempt of good making, in an attempt of creating instantly a middle class, in an attempt to turn development in the colony instead of only extracting from the colonies. One is going to try to build the ideal city, the new city. And what better model, of course, than the modernist model to build the new town, to invent the new city. Something that one didn't think about before, surely not before in Congo. As you see some images, these are from Bukavu. See some of it are complete new towns, so they are built with schools, and some of the best brutalist Belgian architecture, I would say there. It's built with all types of communal facilities. Even the Palace of Justice has to look like a Sputnik that comes out of the sky, that you are joyful to go to court. But there's also medical installations, there's also, of course, schools. But basically, it is about housing, equipment, schools, churches, in all the variations. I'll keep it for this. This is an operation that's basically done by the Office d'État Africain as a state organization. There's two leading architects, Emile Renvaux and Emile Heymans, two Flemish architects, trained in the La Cambre school, which was the only modernist school in Belgium at that moment, and as Flemish architects escaping to the colony as the space of liberty, escaping to the colony away from Belgium, which is dominated by old fashions and old habitudes, and where there's no opportunity for Flemish architects at that moment. So they have their field of experimentation, they have their laboratory of inventing, making, creating out of scratch, or at least one is thinking out of scratch, one is thinking that there is nothing, and surely there was no thinking, and there was no real African city, or surely there was no city for the Africans before, as they were pushed out of the cities, as they were kept out of the cities, that they were only in the mining camps and the plantations, and for the industrial equipments, but not really cities being built. So out of scratch, in models in town planning perspective that seem stolen from the Soviet Union as the linear city, in a kind of strange combination in the Cold War of combining deconstructivist and modernist principles, on the model of a hybrid model of the linear city and the neighborhood unit, one is going to try to build new cities. These models of the linear city, they are transposed on the realities of the context, so the linear city along the rail becomes a linear city along the shores of the lake, and the linear repetition of always the same becomes the repetition of semi-rural settlements and more urban settlements. Bagira and Katutu are two of these fantastic, between brackets, new modernist projects, reinventions of, or inventions on site of what the new city might be. It's the plan for Katutu and the plan for Bagira, or Katutu and Bagira in the opposite direction. When you start looking to these plans, they have something strange in them, or at least at second view, or at least I started wondering of course, you see the regularity, you see the place assigned for the housing, you see the place assigned for the building, but actually half of the surface of the city is not city, it's only nature, or it is invented nature, it is created nature, it is a kind of idea of the jungle, it's an idea of the new Garden of Eden, which will be the hosting, which will be the place in which the new city would be embedded. The entre-deux in the tropical fantasy is living in nature. The city, the reinvented city, is living in the landscape. Not so much landscape, it's living in nature. It's living in this kind of voluptuous nature that in the imagination and partially in reality, although it will be different in Kinshasa, which is only sand plains, is embedding the new, the built, the constructed, the bars, we will come back on that, is to position them in nature. This goes for most of this. It's about landscape and building, it's about green and white, but there's as much attention in the plans for the green as for the white. There's as much attention for the in-between, for what is in between the buildings, as what is the buildings themselves. Relatively strange for architects. Of course, you also can read kind of the basic concept of the neighborhood unit, which is transposed in an African context, with an awful lot of schools, and then a commercial center, and so on, with the different colors that these public infrastructures have, going from the police station, the municipality building, and so on. Because hand in hand with the building of the new city, goes hand in hand with that, goes the invention or the creation or the attempt of creating an emerging democracy. The new towns that are being built are also the place in which elections will be held, in which, as a gradual step, bottom up from the most small scale, will be organized new institutions that will manage, that will govern the country, starting with relatively small settlements of 3,000 to 4,000 houses at the most, as a scale which one is imagining is feasible to transmit the colony in the very, very long term to the native population. Hence there are municipality buildings, hence there's a council building, hence there's a police station, hence there's a palace of justice, hence there's also the hospital, and so on. The principles on this are built are not that original. You find them in all the handbooks of the 1940s, 1950s, the neighborhood unit, the new town, the overlap. And the housing actually is also not that original. It's actually a Flemish or a Belgian workers' class housing, which is redrawn, is put in the copy machine and put on 70%, so it's a little bit smaller. But basically, it is more or less the same. The reasoning of the family house, the reasoning of the shrinking family house, it becomes an existence minimum house, very well measured to the smallest possible size and the most possible effect, and a functionalization of spaces. The distinction between the works class housing in Belgium or in Europe for large scale and what is proposed, what is built on a massive scale is not so big. There's all types of variations. They come to 19 types at a certain moment of these different things, and one start imagining of how they could be inhabited. And the drawings, of course, are beautiful, at least we think so. But they are more about an imagination of what dwelling could be if you transpose it, if you give it to someone else, if you make this present, if you bring in the turn of development this massive operational country. And there's all types of imaginations of what this urbanity then would start looking at. And in this imagination, there's always the forefront is anyway always for nature. It's always for the trees, it's always for the plants, it's always for not the architecture in a certain way. And when it's realized, it's also like that. In Bukavu, it is just within the eucalyptus woods, which by the way are artificial, which are not indigenous. You could say it looks a bit like Club Med, no? It looks a bit like Club Med because, I don't know, but all the plans I've shown you of houses and all the photographs I've shown you of... there's always nature on it, by the way. There's very few people on it. Sometimes here and there you would find a bar, but basically these houses are floating in more or less emptiness or in gardens, in the landscape, embedded within the landscape, On the foreground, the first squatter settlements, and the counter model on the background of the new city. But as you see, most of these houses, almost 90% of these houses, they would not have a garden. They would not have a plot. They would not have a property. They would not be landing on, we give a parcel, we give a land. There was a very big discussion, a very awkward discussion in the 1940s and the 1950s when one effectively started doing that. We had a strange notion of the Congolais évolué, the one that makes an evolution, that is not civilized yet, not needs the same rights. So we need to build cities for these people, we need to give them houses, we need to invent the new city, but are we going to give them land? Which is their own land, by the way, but anyways. Strange reasoning starts occurring of course you have the native legislation, you have the native traditions in what is land, and can it be sold? Can it be individual? In the own culture, of course, it starts with having the property of the land. Now we are going to produce 40,000 houses, we are going to invent the new city, we're going to build a massive amount in all proportions for a new citizenship. The new citizenship doesn't go hand in hand with handing over land. One is referring to the native customs when it comes to having land, and then the land is communal property. The land is from the tribe. The land is from the ancestors. It is negotiated. It's not something that you have as a person. It's not something that you have as a family. It's a strange discussion because it always has been one of the arguments why Western civilization would be more appropriate and why it would be superior and why we would have to educate and why we would have to civilize and why we would have to bring things. But when it comes at the end of the day, when it's handing over, we're not going to hand over land. Hence, we're not going to give them gardens. Hence, we're going to build buildings which are situated within a landscape. There's two terms, there's the house and there's the landscape. And the landscape is communal, it's imagined public, and a lot of things should happen on it. As a garden, a lot of things should happen on it. There could be convents, there could be churches, there could be silence, places of silence. Sometimes they could be empty. But basically what is built is this. Now, when it comes to the houses, there's also very strange things are happening. Or at least one is in a turmoil of the after-war period. There is a massive migration to the city. One doesn't know how to cope with it. One starting building for, one never did it before. The first invention, of course, is the modernists are learning it. The existence minimum house, of course, is the perfect model. You shrink it a bit, it becomes an economy of scale, and we produce it massively. It becomes affordable, and we build it, and nobody can afford it. You can rationalize it as much as you want, but the income that the people have in Congo at that moment doesn't allow them to take the loans that are necessary. So partially it are the big employers that start renting these houses. Partially it is with special funds, the Fonds du Roi, and inventions like that one is trying to find people. But basically, the houses remain empty because the mismatch between the type and the situation does not work. So one has to reinvent one has to rethink. One is producing massively and nobody takes it. The employers take a part, but that's not the idea, because it's not the idea, the paternalist idea of employers giving housing, but it should be the families. But actually there are no families. Actually 70% are just men. They're just young bachelors coming from the countryside, invading the city. Of course there are women, but then there's the status of this women. Is this femme libre? There's few mamas. So we have a society in turmoil, you have a demography in turmoil, but you don't have the imagined family to which you can. So the next invention becomes let's turn things around. If the existence minimum doesn't work, if what we learned in school doesn't work, even if we put it in the copy machine that doesn't exist yet at that moment, 70% doesn't work, let's do the opposite, let's exaggerate, let's build a maximum house. Let's forget about economy, let's build a house with many rooms. So they can rent them out to these bachelors, and the wife can have their workspaces. They can start making clothes, or the man can do a buy job, and he can have an insurance office. So we built much more. This logement à occupation variable. Perhaps we also can use it to use as schools, as long as we don't build enough schools. So we start building buildings that can be occupied in a variable way, that can accommodate the mismatch that is not there in demographic terms. We imagine families, they're not there, they're bachelors, they're starting families that can grow, and in the growing, the children can occupy the rooms, but in the meantime, they can be rented out, and the renting out can pay. So there's a whole construction, imagined construction of what this could be. So actually, 10 years before Rossi, the reinvention of typology as architecture, as a space, as not a functional thing, but a type of. And of course, when you've seen all the plans, well, you will believe me, I hope. The plans you've seen, they're plans without gardens, of course. They're plans with different accesses from the back side and the front side, so you can approach them from different sides, but they're very well studied. They are there. It can be a variable occupation, but the architecture should be fixed. The architecture should be perfect. We should study the colors. We should study how it starts and how it finishes. So we put objects, and in between we have our nature, which is free space, which is public space, which is collective space, that we never will hand over. And we start building far too big things. And some of the richer middle class that starts emerging can afford them. They rather invest in their cars, but anyway, they also invest in the houses. In the end, it doesn't work, and in the end, one is going to try. In 1958, or this drawing, so it's not existence minimum. Let's go simply for the shelter. But in the shelter, when the drawing of the shelter, nevertheless, it is the most reduction of what a house could be. It's a roof, it's a separation, and it's privacy. In the sketch above, it is a facade, it becomes a building, it becomes a form, it becomes a shape. As rudimentary as the architecture might be, it becomes something that one has to fix, and it has to be in a natural environment. It has to have all this haze, it has to have these trees, even on the sand plains of Kinshasa. Now, so, in the plains of Kinshasa, in the beginning, this is this. So in the beginning, this in between is not this imagined tropical forest, not is this imagined tropical garden of Eden that will form the new city, but is that. In 2000, it was more or less this. These are photographs of Marie-Françoise Plissard on a mission in 2000. In the year 2000, we have done 2 research pieces on what happened with this environment in 2000 and 2002. This is the school of Matonge. So now I have to tell you, as this is in colonial history, it's often seen as this is the present. This is what we offer. It has been documented as that. This is planted architecture, and this is what is given to the colony at independence. In the insurgency of 1959, these cités have been looted. They have been destroyed. Well, a large part has been destroyed, at least most of the public infrastructure. The municipal buildings, the council buildings, the police stations, the youth centers, everything that was paternalizing has been put to fire and has been erased. The only thing that was kept as public infrastructure were the schools. The only things that are left that are still functioning today, in the most elementary form, as they are, as pure functionalist architecture, to which you don't have to add anything, in which you only should distract things, in which you only have the pure pleasure of form and shape and shade and light and protection, are the school buildings. The school buildings are the only things which are not encroached, which are not stolen, which are not taken away, but which are cherished. There must be something strange with the expectation of what education will give to our children that is universal, but the schools are the only thing. For the rest, the city looks like this. So the cities, they have been looted, they have been the scenes of insurgencies, as something that has been pushed away, we don't want it, as something that immediately after independence we take. It's our war treasure, it's our independence treasure that we take. They have been looted in the insurgency at the end of the Mobutu regime, when the Mobutu regime was imploding. Everything that can be stolen, everything that can be taken away, every finishing, every window, every cable of electricity has been taken out of it. They have had very nice days and they have had very calm days. This is around 2000 at the most depth of the economic crisis, in a country in turmoil, in a country in civil war, when nothing happens in the city. What the picture is showing is all the construction industry that is not happening. There's nothing happening in the city. But the city basically looks like this. You will recognize the types, and you will recognize what the population did with these types. They didn't respect it too much. It is like there is a new city that has overwhelmed it. There's like a new carpet, that has a new textile that has been made of it. In a certain way, when you look to the pictures, so Lemba, Matete, Matonge, and Njili, and Lemba in Kinshasa, there's a new carpet that has been woven over the city. You could think that the modernist project is simply a relic. Most of the upper floors actually are not used. They are used for stocking goods. They're used for putting all these plastic bags with all the goods that they keep, but they're very seldomly used. So, to a certain extent, the original houses are just a relic, and the new city is built around it. There's only one in which this does not happen. That is one that has been taken by the military in Kintambo, a city in which nothing's changed. There's two cities like this, Kintambo and a piece of Lemba West, which was part of the university and which was housing for the university staff, for professors and so on like us, and which were renting housing, and by renting housing didn't change anything to it. But for the rest, the Matetes and the Njilis and Matongos and so on have been in a kind of calm and very turbulent periods, have been changing publics, have been changing ownerships, having been changing domination, have been changing ethnic compositions, have been changing uses in very brutal ways very often. So the imagined public land has immediately been turned in private. It has been encroached, it has been taken over, it has been made a private city, where there was only landscape. Actually, a city of streets has been made, a city of, in some of the streets, even of some of the trees survived. But it has been encroached to a certain extent that it starts defining public space, and public space on which we have, at that time, all the telephone shops. It's just before the mobile phone period. The public telephone shops, the hairdressers, the churches that come in, the evangelical churches, the healing churches, that start invading the territory and across it. It has become a private city. It has become the city of investment. If the Kasai boys from the informal diamond mining need a destination for their money, when they don't trust the banks, when they don't have an investment possibility, it becomes something for the diamond boys to invest, to chase away actually the existing inhabitants. When the music scene in Matangi takes the overhand, they claim, they take as a kind of war treasure part of the patrimony, and they simply change it. As in a strange iteration between refusal and revendication, in being given and refused, and taking and claiming and changing and transforming, in grabbing another city is formed. Most of the constructions that you will have seen that are added, and actually the added city becomes the city, and the planned city actually becomes the relict, they are doing everything opposite that what the colonial architects wanted. colonial architecture had studied this orientation and climate and this and that, and houses should be oriented so because of the sun and this and that. And so all the additions, all the new things which are built are just perpendicular to it. The opposite kind. You say A, we do B. You say it has to be setting in an open landscape, we fill it. It has to have this orientation, we change the orientation. As a kind of warp and woof and black and white, it does just the opposite of all the rules which were posed from the treasured object of architecture, in which the variable occupation unit was a pure object of architecture. It becomes the growing house that leaves behind the old house, but nevertheless is structured by the existing. The major nice thing about this transformation process, I think, is that it is remaining in Kinshasa until recently. It remains, the Oka neighborhoods remain the guiding image of what the expectation of the house is. If you can choose a dream house, it's an Oka house that you want. It is the Oka house even if you leave it behind as an image and you construct your own thing with it. Perhaps because it's structured, perhaps because it has basic infrastructure, perhaps because the existing of the colonial enforced and given form goes in interaction, in a dialectic interaction as thesis and antithesis and warp and woof, creating a new synthesis of a new African urbanity. And I will keep it to this. Thank you.